Chapter 4 of the Aspern Papers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Perhaps it did, but all the same, 6 weeks later, toward the middle of June, the moment when Mrs. Prest undertook her annual migration, I had made no measurable advance. I was obliged to confess to her that I'd had no results to speak of. My first step had been unexpectedly rapid, but there was no appearance that it would be followed by a second. I was 1,000 miles from taking tea with my hostesses, that privilege of which, as I reminded Mrs. Prest, we had both had a vision. She reproached me with wanting boldness, and I answered that even to be bold you must have an opportunity. You may push on through a breach, but you can't batter down a dead wall. She answered that the breach I had already made was big enough to admit an army, and accused me of wasting precious hours and whimpering in her salon when I ought to have been carrying on the struggle in the field. It is true that I went to see her very often, on the theory that it would console me (I freely expressed my discouragement) for my want of success on my own premises. But I began to perceive that it did not console me to be perpetually chaffed for my scruples, especially when I was really so vigilant, and I was rather glad when my derisive friend closed her house for the summer. She had expected to gather amusement from the drama of my intercourse with the Misses Bordereau, and she was disappointed that the intercourse, and consequently the drama, had not come off. "They'll lead you on to your ruin," she said before she left Venice. "They'll get all your money without showing you a scrap." I think I settled out of my business with more concentration after she had gone away. It was a fact that up to that time I had not, save on a single brief occasion, had even a moment's contact with my queer hostesses. The exception had occurred when I carried them, according to my promise, the terrible 3,000 francs. Then I found Miss Tita waiting for me in the hall, and she took the money from my hand so that I did not see her aunt. The old lady had promised to receive me, but she apparently thought nothing of breaking that vow. The money was contained in a bag of chamois leather, of respectable dimensions, which my banker had given me, and Miss Tita had to make a big fist to receive it. This she did with extreme solemnity, though I tried to treat the affair a little as a joke. It was in no jocular strain, yet it was with simplicity that she inquired, weighing the money in her 2 palms, "Don't you think it's too much?" To which I replied that would depend upon the amount of pleasure I should get for it. Hereupon she turned away from me quickly, as she had done the day before, murmuring in a tone different from any she had used hitherto, "Oh, pleasure, pleasure! There's no pleasure in this house." After this, for a long time, I never saw her, and I wondered that the common chances of the day should not have helped us to meet. It could only be evident that she was immensely on her guard against them, and in addition to this the house was so big that for each other we were lost in it. I used to look out for her hopefully as I crossed the sala in my comings and goings, but I was not rewarded with a glimpse of the tail of her dress. It was as if she never peeped out of her aunt's apartment. I used to wonder what she did there week after week and year after year. I had never encountered such a violent parti pris of seclusion. It was more than keeping quiet, it was like hunted creatures feigning death. The 2 ladies appeared to have no visitors whatever and no sort of contact with the world. I judged at least that people could not have come to the house, and that Miss Tita could not have gone out without my having some observation of it. I did what I disliked myself for doing, reflecting that it was only once in a way. I questioned my servant about their habits, and let him divine that I should be interested in any information he could pick up. But he picked up amazingly little for a knowing Venetian. It must be added that where there is a perpetual fast there are very few crumbs on the floor. His cleverness in other ways was sufficient, if it was not quite all that I had attributed to him on the occasion of my first interview with Miss Tita. He had helped my gondolier to bring me round a boatload of furniture, and when these articles had been carried to the top of the palace and distributed according to our associated wisdom, he organized my household with such promptitude as was consistent with the fact that it was composed exclusively of himself. He made me, in short, as comfortable as I could be with my indifferent prospects. I should have been glad if he had fallen in love with Miss Bordereau's maid, or failing this had taken her in aversion. Either event might have brought about some kind of a catastrophe, and a catastrophe might have led to some parley. It was my idea that she would have been sociable, and I myself on various occasions saw her flit to and fro on domestic errands, so that I was sure she was accessible. But I tasted of no gossip from that fountain, and I afterward learned that Pasquale's affections were fixed upon an object that made him heedless of other women. This was a young lady with a powdered face, a yellow cotton gown and much leisure, who used often to come to see him. She practiced at her convenience the art of a stringer of beads. These ornaments are made in Venice in profusion. She had her pocket full of them, and I used to find them on the floor of my apartment, and kept an eye on the maiden in the house. It was not for me, of course, to make the domestics tattle, and I never said a word to Miss Bordereau's cook. It seemed to me a proof of the old lady's determination to have nothing to do with me that she should never have sent me a receipt for my 3 months' rent. For some days I looked out for it, and then, when I had given it up, I wasted a good deal of time in wondering what her reason had been for neglecting so indispensable and familiar a form. At first I was tempted to send her a reminder, after which I relinquished the idea, against my judgment as to what was right in the particular case, on the general ground of wishing to keep quiet. If Miss Bordereau suspected me of ulterior aims she would suspect me less if I should be businesslike, and yet I consented not to be so. It was possible she intended her omission as an impertinence, a visible irony, to show how she could overreach people who attempted to overreach her. On that hypothesis it was well to let her see that one did not notice her little tricks. The real reading of the matter, I afterward perceived, was simply the poor old woman's desire to emphasize the fact that I was in the enjoyment of a favor as rigidly limited as it had been liberally bestowed. She had given me part of her house, and now she would not give me even a morsel of paper with her name on it. Let me say that even at first this did not make me too miserable, for the whole episode was essentially delightful to me. I foresaw that I should have a summer after my own literary heart, and the sense of holding my opportunity was much greater than the sense of losing it. There could be no Venetian business without patience, and since I adored the place I was much more in the spirit of it for having laid in a large provision. That spirit kept me perpetual company and seemed to look out at me from the revived immortal face, in which all his genius shone, of the great poet who was my prompter. I had invoked him and he had come. He hovered before me half the time. It was as if his bright ghost had returned to earth to tell me that he regarded the affair as his own no less than mine, and that we should see it, fraternally, cheerfully, to a conclusion. It was as if he had said, "Poor dear, be easy with her. She has some natural prejudices. Only give her time." Strange as it may appear to you, she was very attractive in 1820. Meanwhile, are we not in Venice together, and what better place is there for the meeting of dear friends? See how it glows with the advancing summer, how the sky and the sea and the rosy air and the marble of the palaces all shimmer and melt together. My eccentric private errand became a part of the general romance and the general glory. I felt even a mystic companionship, a moral fraternity with all those who in the past had been in the service of art. They had worked for beauty, for a devotion. And what else was I doing? That element was in everything that Geoffrey Aspern had written, and I was only bringing it to light. I lingered in the sala when I went to and fro. I used to watch, as long as I thought decent, the door that led to Miss Bordereau's part of the house. A person observing me might have supposed I was trying to cast a spell upon it, or attempting some odd experiment in hypnotism. But I was only praying it would open, or thinking what treasure probably lurked behind it. I hold it singular, as I look back, that I should never have doubted for a moment that the sacred relics were there, never have failed to feel a certain joy at being under the same roof with them. After all, they were under my hand, they had not escaped me yet, and they made my life continuous in a fashion with the illustrious life they had touched at the other end. I lost myself in this satisfaction to the point of assuming, in my quiet extravagance, that poor Miss Tita also went back, as I used to phrase it. She did indeed, the gentle spinster, but not quite so far as Geoffrey Aspern, who was simply hearsay to her, quite as he was to me. Only she had lived for years with Juliana, she had seen and handled the papers and, even though she was stupid, some esoteric knowledge had rubbed off on her. That was what the old woman represented, esoteric knowledge, and this was the idea with which my editorial heart used to thrill. It literally beat faster often of an evening when I had been out, as I stopped with my candle in the re-echoing hall on my way up to bed. It was as if at such a moment as that, in the stillness, after the long contradiction of the day, Miss Bordereau's secrets were in the air, the wonder of her survival more palpable. These were the acute impressions. I had them in another form, with more of a certain sort of reciprocity, during the hours that I sat in the garden, looking up over the top of my book at the closed windows of my hostess. In these windows no sign of life ever appeared. It was as if, for fear of my catching a glimpse of them, the two ladies passed their days in the dark. But this only proved to me that they had something to conceal, which was what I had wished to demonstrate. Their motionless shutters became as expressive as eyes consciously closed, and I took comfort in thinking that at all events, though invisible themselves, they saw me between the lashes. I made a point of spending as much time as possible in the garden to justify the picture I had originally given of my horticultural passion. And I not only spent time, but, hang it, as I said, I spent money. As soon as I had got my rooms arranged and could give the proper thought to the matter, I surveyed the place with a clever expert and made terms for having it put in order. I was sorry to do this, for personally I liked it better as it was, with its weeds and its wild rough tangle, its sweet characteristic Venetian shabbiness. I had to be consistent to keep my promise that I would smother the house in flowers. Moreover, I formed this grateful project that by flowers I would make my way. I would succeed by big nosegays. I would batter the old women with lilies. I would bombard their citadel with roses. Their door would have to yield to the pressure when a mountain of carnations should be piled up against it. The place, in truth, had been brutally neglected. The Venetian capacity for dawdling is of the largest, and for a good many days unlimited litter was all my gardener had to show for his ministrations. There was a great digging of holes and carting about of earth, and after a while I grew so impatient that I had thoughts of sending for my bouquets to the nearest stand. But I reflected that the ladies would see through the chinks of their shutters that they must have been bought, and might make up their minds from this that I was a humbug. So I composed myself, and finally, though the delay was long, perceived some appearances of bloom. This encouraged me, and I waited serenely enough till they multiplied. Meanwhile the real summer days arrived and began to pass, and as I look back upon them they seem to me almost the happiest of my life. I took more and more care to be in the garden whenever it was not too hot. I had an arbor arranged and a low table and an armchair put into it, and I carried out books and portfolios (I had always some business of writing in hand), and worked and waited and mused and hoped, while the golden hours elapsed and the plants drank in the light and the inscrutable old palace turned pale, and then, as the day waned, began to flush in it and my papers rustled in the wandering breeze of the Adriatic. Considering how little satisfaction I got from it at first, it is remarkable that I should not have grown more tired of wondering what mystic rites of ennui the Misses Bordereau celebrated in their darkened rooms, whether this had always been the tenor of their life, and how in previous years they had escaped elbowing their neighbors. It was clear that they must have had other habits and other circumstances, that they must once have been young or at least middle-aged. There was no end to the questions it was possible to ask about them, and no end to the answers it was not possible to frame. I had known many of my country people in Europe, and was familiar with the strange ways they were liable to take up there, but the Mrs. Bordereau formed altogether a new type of the American absentee. Indeed, it was plain that the American name had ceased to have any application to them. I had seen this in the 10 minutes I spent in the old woman's room. You could never have said whence they came, from the appearance of either of them. Wherever it was, they had long ago dropped the local accent and fashion. There was nothing in them that one recognized, and putting the question of speech aside, they might have been Norwegians or Spaniards. Miss Bordereau, after all, had been in Europe nearly 3/4 of a century. It appeared by some verses addressed to her by Aspern on the occasion of his own second absence from America, verses of which Cumnor and I had, after infinite conjecture, established solidly enough the date, that she was even then, as a girl of 20, on the foreign side of the sea. There was an implication in the poem, I hope not just for the phrase, that he had come back for her sake. We had no real light upon her circumstances at that moment, any more than we had upon her origin, which we believed to be of the sort usually spoken of as modest. Cumnor had a theory that she had been a governess in some family in which the poet visited, and that, in consequence of her position, there was from the first something unavowed, or rather something positively clandestine, in their relations. I, on the other hand, had hatched a little romance, according to which she was the daughter of an artist, a painter or a sculptor, who had left the Western world when the century was fresh to study in the ancient schools. It was essential to my hypothesis that this amiable man should have lost his wife, should have been poor and unsuccessful, and should have had a second daughter of a disposition quite different from Juliana's. It was also indispensable that he should have been accompanied to Europe by these young ladies, and should have established himself there for the remainder of a struggling, saddened life. There was a further implication that Miss Bordereau had in her youth a perverse and adventurous, albeit a generous and fascinating character, and that she had passed through some singular vicissitudes. By what passions had she been ravaged, by what sufferings had she been blanched, what store of memories had she laid away for the monotonous future? I asked myself these things as I sat spinning theories about her in my arbor, and the bees droned in the flowers. It was incontestable that, whether for right or for wrong, most readers of certain of Aspern's poems not as ambiguous as the sonnets, scarcely more divine, I think, of Shakespeare, had taken for granted that Juliana had not always adhered to the steep footway of renunciation. There hovered about her name a perfume of reckless passion, an intimation that she had not been exactly as the respectable young person in general. Was this a sign that her singer had betrayed her, had given her away, as we say nowadays, to posterity? Certain it is that it would have been difficult to put one's finger on the passage in which her fair fame suffered an imputation. Moreover, was not any fame fair enough that was so sure of duration and was associated with works immortal through their beauty? It was a part of my idea that the young lady had had a foreign lover, and an unedifying tragical rupture, before her meeting with Geoffrey Aspern. She had lived with her father and sister in a queer, old-fashioned, expatriated, artistic Bohemia, in the days when the aesthetic was only the academic, and the painters who knew the best models for a contadina and a pifferaro wore peaked hats and long hair. It was a society less furnished than the coteries of today, in its ignorance of the wonderful chances, the opportunities of the early bird with which its path was strewn, with tatters of old stuff and fragments of old crockery, so that Miss Bordereau appeared not to have picked up or to have inherited many objects of importance. There was no enviable bric-a-brac, with its provoking legend of cheapness, in the room in which I had seen her. Such a fact as that suggested bareness, but none the less it worked happily into the sentimental interest I had always taken in the early movements of my countrymen as visitors to Europe. When Americans went abroad in 1820 there was something romantic, almost heroic in it, as compared with the perpetual ferryings of the present hour, when photography and other conveniences have annihilated surprise. Miss Bordereau sailed with her family on a tossing brig in the days of long voyages and sharp differences. She had her emotions on the top of yellow diligences, passed the night at inns where she dreamed of travelers' tales, and was struck, on reaching the Eternal City, with the elegance of Roman pearls and scarves. There was something touching to me in all that, and my imagination frequently went back to the period. If Miss Bordereau carried it there, of course Geoffrey Aspern at other times had done so a great deal more. It was a much more important fact, if one were looking at his genius critically, that he had lived in the days before the general transfusion. It had happened to me to regret that he had known Europe at all. I should have liked to see what he would have written without that experience, by which he had incontestably been enriched. But as his fate had ordered otherwise, I went with him. I tried to judge how the old world would have struck him. It was not only there, however, that I watched him. The relations he had entertained with the new had even a livelier interest. His own country, after all, had had most of his life, and his muse, as they said at the time, was essentially American. That was originally what I had loved him for, that at a period when our native land was nude and crude and provincial, when the famous atmosphere it is supposed to lack was not even missed, when literature was lonely there and art and form almost impossible, he had found means to live and write like one of the first, to be free and general and not at all afraid, to feel, understand, and express everything. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the Aspern Papers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I was seldom at home in the evening, for when I attempted to occupy myself in my apartments the lamplight brought in a swarm of noxious insects, and it was too hot for closed windows. Accordingly I spent the late hours either on the water (the moonlight of Venice is famous) or in the splendid square which serves as a vast forecourt to the strange old basilica of St. Mark. I sat in front of Florian's cafe, eating ices, listening to music, talking with acquaintances. The traveler will remember how the immense cluster of tables and little chairs stretches like a promontory into the smooth lake of the piazza. The whole place of a summer's evening, under the stars and with all the lamps, all the voices and light footsteps on marble, the only sounds of the arcades that enclose it, is like an open-air saloon dedicated to cooling drinks and to a still finer degustation, that of the exquisite impressions received during the day. When I did not prefer to keep mine to myself, there was always a stray tourist, disencumbered of his Baedeker, to discuss them with, or some domesticated painter rejoicing in the return of the season of strong effects. The wonderful church with its low domes and bristling embroideries, the mystery of its mosaic and sculpture, looking ghostly in the tempered gloom, and the sea breeze passed between the twin columns of the piazzetta, the lintels of a door no longer guarded, as gently as if a rich curtain were swaying there. I used sometimes on these occasions to think of the Misses Bordereau and of the pity of their being shut up in apartments which in the Venetian July even Venetian vastness did not prevent from being stuffy. Their life seemed miles away from the life of the piazza, and no doubt it was really too late to make the austere Juliana change her habits. But poor Miss Tita would have enjoyed one of Florian's ices, I was sure. Sometimes I even had thoughts of carrying one home to her. Fortunately my patience bore fruit. and I was not obliged to do anything so ridiculous. One evening about the middle of July I came in earlier than usual. I forget what chance had led to this, and instead of going up to my quarters made my way into the garden. The temperature was very high. It was such a night as one would gladly have spent in the open air, and I was in no hurry to go to bed. I had floated home in my gondola, listening to the slow splash of the oar in the narrow dark canals, and now the only thought that solicited me was the vague reflection that it would be pleasant to recline at one's length in the fragrant darkness on a garden bench. The odor of the canal was doubtless at the bottom of that aspiration, and the breath of the garden as I entered it gave consistency to my purpose. It was delicious, just such an air as must have trembled with Romeo's vows when he stood among the flowers and raised his arms to his mistress's balcony. I looked at the windows of the palace to see if by chance the example of Verona not being far off, had been followed, but everything was dim as usual and everything was still. Juliana, on summer nights in her youth, might have murmured down from open windows at Geoffrey Aspern, but Miss Tita was not a poet's mistress any more than I was a poet. This, however, did not prevent my gratification from being great, as I became aware on reaching the end of the garden that Miss Tita was seated in my little bower. At first I only made out an indistinct figure, not in the least counting on such an overture from one of my hostesses. It even occurred to me that some sentimental maidservant had stolen in to keep a tryst with her sweetheart. I was going to turn away, not to frighten her, when the figure rose to its height and I recognized Miss Bordereau's niece. I must do myself the justice to say that I did not wish to frighten her either, and much as I had longed for some such accident I should have been capable of retreating. It was as if I had laid a trap for her by coming home earlier than usual and adding to that eccentricity by creeping into the garden. As she rose she spoke to me, and then I reflected that perhaps, secure in my almost inveterate absence, it was her nightly practice to take a lonely airing. There was no trap in truth, because I had had no suspicion. At first I took it for granted that the words she uttered expressed discomfiture at my arrival, but as she repeated them (I had not caught them clearly) I had the surprise of hearing her say, "Oh dear, I'm so very glad you've come." She and her aunt had in common the property of unexpected speeches. She came out of the arbor almost as if she were going to throw herself into my arms. I hasten to add that she did nothing of the kind. She did not even shake hands with me. It was a gratification to her to see me, and presently she told me why. Because she was nervous when she was out of doors at night alone. The plants and bushes looked so strange in the dark, and there were all sorts of queer sounds. She could not tell what they were, like the noises of animals. She stood close to me, looking about her with an air of greater security, but without any demonstration of interest in me as an individual. Then I guessed that nocturnal prowlings were not in the least her habit, and I was also reminded I had been struck with the circumstance in talking with her before I took possession that it was impossible to overestimate her simplicity. "You speak as if you were lost in the backwoods," I said, laughing. "How you manage to keep out of this charming place when you have only 3 steps to take to get into it is more than I have yet been able to discover. You hide away mighty well so long as I am on the premises, I know. But I had a hope that you peeped out a little at other times. You and your poor aunt are worse off than Carmelite nuns in their cells. Should you mind telling me how you exist without air, without exercise, without any sort of human contact? I don't see how you carry on the common business of life." She looked at me as if I were talking some strange tongue, and her answer was so little of an answer that I was considerably irritated. "We go to bed very early, earlier than you could believe." I was on the point of saying that this only deepened the mystery, when she gave me some relief by adding, "Before you came we were not so private. But I have never been out at night." "Never in these fragrant alleys, blooming here under your nose?" "Ah," said Miss Tita, "they were never nice till now." There was an unmistakable reference in this and a flattering comparison, so that it seemed to me I had gained a small advantage. As it would help me to follow it up, to establish a sort of grievance, I asked her why, since she thought my garden nice, she had never thanked me in any way for the flowers I had been sending up in such quantities for the previous 3 weeks. I had not been discouraged; there had been, as she would have observed, a daily armful. But I had been brought up in the common forms, and a word of recognition now and then would have touched me in the right place. "Why, I didn't know they were for me." "They were for both of you. Why should I make a difference?" Miss Tita reflected as if she might, by thinking of a reason for that, but she failed to produce one. Instead of this she asked abruptly, "Why in the world do you want to know us?" "I ought after all to make a difference," I replied. "That question is your aunt's; it isn't yours. You wouldn't ask it if you hadn't been put up to it." "She didn't tell me to ask you," Miss Tita replied without confusion. She was the oddest mixture of the shrinking and the direct. "Well, she has often wondered about it herself and expressed her wonder to you. She has insisted on it, so that she has put the idea into your head that I am insufferably pushing. Upon my word, I think I have been very discreet. And how completely your aunt must have lost every tradition of sociability to see anything out of the way in the idea that respectable, intelligent people, living as we do under the same roof, should occasionally exchange a remark. What could be more natural? We are of the same country and we have at least some of the same tastes, since, like you, I am intensely fond of Venice." My interlocutress appeared incapable of grasping more than one clause in any proposition, and she declared, quickly, eagerly, as if she were answering my whole speech, "I am not in the least fond of Venice. I should like to go far away." "Has she always kept you back so?" I went on, to show her that I could be as irrelevant as herself. "She told me to come out tonight. She has told me very often," said Miss Tita. "It is I who wouldn't come. I don't like to leave her." "Is she too weak? Is she failing?" I demanded, with more emotion, I think, than I intended to show. I judged this by the way her eyes rested upon me in the darkness. It embarrassed me a little, and to turn the matter off I continued genially, "Do let us sit down together comfortably somewhere, and you will tell me all about her." Miss Tita made no resistance to this. We found a bench less secluded, less confidential, as it were, than the one in the arbor, and we were still sitting there when I heard midnight ring out from those clear bells of Venice which vibrate with a solemnity of their own over the lagoon and hold the air so much more than the chimes of other places. We were together more than an hour, and our interview gave, as it struck me, a great lift to my undertaking. Miss Tita accepted the situation without a protest. She had avoided me for 3 months, yet now she treated me almost as if these 3 months had made me an old friend. If I had chosen I might have inferred from this that though she had avoided me she had given a good deal of consideration to doing so. She paid no attention to the flight of time, never worried at my keeping her so long away from her aunt. She talked freely, answering questions and asking them, and not even taking advantage of certain longish pauses with which they inevitably alternated, to say she thought she had better go in. It was almost as if she were waiting for something I might say to her, and intended to give me my opportunity. I was the more struck by this as she told me that her aunt had been less well for a good many days, and in a way that was rather new. She was weaker; at moments it seemed as if she had no strength at all, yet more than ever before she wished to be left alone. That was why she had told her to come out, not even to remain in her own room, which was alongside. She said her niece irritated her, made her nervous. She sat still for hours together, as if she were asleep. She had always done that, musing and dozing, but at such times formerly she gave at intervals some small sign of life, of interest, liking her companion to be near her with her work. Miss Tita confided to me that at present her aunt was so motionless that she sometimes feared she was dead. Moreover, she took hardly any food; one couldn't see what she lived on. The great thing was that she still on most days got up. The serious job was to dress her, to wheel her out of her bedroom. She clung to as many of her old habits as possible, and she had always, little company as they had received for years, made a point of sitting in the parlor. I scarcely knew what to think of all this, of Miss Tita's sudden conversion to sociability, and of the strange circumstance that the more the old lady appeared to decline toward her end, the less she should desire to be looked after. The story did not hang together, and I even asked myself whether it were not a trap laid for me, the result of a design to make me show my hand. I could not have told why my companions, as they could only by courtesy be called, should have this purpose, why they should try to trip up so lucrative a lodger. At any rate I kept on my guard so that Miss Tita should not have occasion again to ask me if I had an arrière-pensée. Poor woman! Before we parted for the night my mind was at rest as to her capacity for entertaining one. She told me more about their affairs than I had hoped. There was no need to be prying, for it evidently drew her out simply to feel that I listened, that I cared. She ceased wondering why I cared, and at last she spoke of the brilliant life they had led years before. She almost chattered. It was Miss Tita who judged it brilliant. She said that when they first came to live in Venice, years and years before, I saw that her mind was essentially vague about dates and the order in which events had occurred. There was scarcely a week that they had not some visitor or did not make some delightful passeggio in the city. They had seen all the curiosities. They had even been to the Lido in a boat. She spoke as if I might think there was a way there on foot. They had had a collation there, brought in 3 baskets and spread out on the grass. I asked her what people they had known, and she said, "Oh, very nice ones, the Cavaliere Bombici and the Contessa Altemura, with whom they had had a great friendship. Also English people, the Churtons and the Goldies, and Mrs. Stockstock, whom they had loved dearly. She was dead and gone, poor dear." That was the case with most of their pleasant circle. This expression was Miss Tita's own, though a few were left, which was a wonder considering how they had neglected them. She mentioned the names of 2 or 3 Venetian old women, of a certain doctor, very clever, who was so kind he came as a friend, he had really given up practice; of the Avvocato Pochintesta, who wrote beautiful poems and had addressed one to her aunt. These people came to see them without fail every year, usually at the Capodanno, and of old her aunt used to make them some little present, her aunt and she together, small things that she, Miss Tita, made herself, like paper lampshades or mats for the decanters of wine at dinner, or those woolen things that in cold weather were worn on the wrists. The last few years there had not been many presents. She could not think what to make, and her aunt had lost her interest and never suggested. But the people came all the same. If the Venetians liked you once, they liked you forever. There was something affecting in the good faith of this sketch of former social glories. The picnic at the Lido had remained vivid through the ages, and poor Miss Tita evidently was of the impression that she had had a brilliant youth. She had, in fact, had a glimpse of the Venetian world in its gossiping, home-keeping, parsimonious professional walks. For I observed for the first time that she had acquired by contact something of the trick of the familiar, soft-sounding, almost infantile speech of the place. I judged that she had imbibed this invertebrate dialect from the natural way the names of things and people, mostly purely local, rose to her lips. If she knew little of what they represented, she knew still less of anything else. Her aunt had drawn in; her failing interest in the table mats and lampshades was a sign of that, and she had not been able to mingle in society or to entertain it alone, so that the matter of her reminiscences struck one as an old world altogether. If she had not been so decent, her references would have seemed to carry one back to the queer rococo Venice of Casanova. I found myself falling into the error of thinking of her too as one of Geoffrey Aspern's contemporaries. This came from her having so little in common with my own. It was possible, I said to myself, that she had not even heard of him. It might very well be that Juliana had not cared to lift, even for her, the veil that covered the temple of her youth. In this case she perhaps would not know of the existence of the papers, and I welcomed that presumption (it made me feel more safe with her) until I remembered that we had believed the letter of disavowal received by Cumnor to be in the handwriting of the niece. If it had been dictated to her she had of course to know what it was about; yet after all the effect of it was to repudiate the idea of any connection with the poet. I held it probable at all events that Miss Tita had not read a word of his poetry. Moreover, if, with her companion, she had always escaped the interviewer, there was little occasion for her having got it into her head that people were "after" the letters. People had not been "after" them, inasmuch as they had not heard of them, and Cumnor's fruitless feeler would have been a solitary accident. When midnight sounded Miss Tita got up, but she stopped at the door of the house only after she had wandered 2 or 3 times with me round the garden. "When shall I see you again?" I asked before she went in, to which she replied with promptness that she should like to come out the next night. She added, however, that she should not come; she was so far from doing everything she liked. "You might do a few things that I like," I said with a sigh. "Oh, you I don't believe you," she murmured at this, looking at me with her simple solemnity. "Why don't you believe me?" "Because I don't understand you." "That is just the sort of occasion to have faith." I could not say more, though I should have liked to, as I saw that I only mystified her, for I had no wish to have it on my conscience that I might pass for having made love to her. Nothing less should I have seemed to do had I continued to beg a lady to believe in me in an Italian garden on a midsummer night. There was some merit in my scruples, for Miss Tita lingered and lingered. I perceived that she felt that she should not really soon come down again, and wished therefore to protract the present. She insisted too on making the talk between us personal to ourselves, and altogether her behavior was such as would have been possible only to a completely innocent woman. "I shall like the flowers better now that I know they are meant also for me." "How could you have doubted it? If you will tell me the kind you like best I will send a double lot of them." "Oh, I like them all best." Then she went on familiarly, "Shall you study, shall you read and write when you go up to your rooms?" "I don't do that at night, at this season. The lamplight brings in the animals." "You might have known that when you came." "I did know it." "And in winter do you work at night?" "I read a good deal, but I don't often write." She listened as if these details had a rare interest, and suddenly a temptation quite at variance with the prudence I had been teaching myself associated itself with her plain mild face. Ah yes, she was safe and I could make her safer. It seemed to me from one moment to another that I could not wait longer, that I really must take a sounding. So I went on. "In general, before I go to sleep, very often in bed it's a bad habit, but I confess to it I read some great poet. In 9 cases out of 10 it's a volume of Geoffrey Aspern." I watched her well as I pronounced that name, but I saw nothing wonderful. Why should I indeed? Was not Geoffrey Aspern the property of the human race? "Oh, we read him, we have read him," she quietly replied. "He is my poet of poets. I know him almost by heart." For an instant Miss Tita hesitated; then her sociability was too much for her. "Oh, by heart, that's nothing," she murmured, smiling. "My aunt used to know him. To know him," she paused an instant and I wondered what she was going to say, "to know him as a visitor." "As a visitor?" I repeated, staring. "He used to call on her and take her out." I continued to stare. "My dear lady, he died 100 years ago." "Well," she said mirthfully, "my aunt is 150." "Mercy on us!" I exclaimed. "Why didn't you tell me before? I should like so to ask her about him." "She wouldn't care for that, she wouldn't tell you," Miss Tita replied. "I don't care what she cares for. She must tell me. It's not a chance to be lost." "Oh, you should have come 20 years ago. Then she still talked about him." "And what did she say?" I asked eagerly. "I don't know, that he liked her immensely." And she? Didn't she like him? She said he was a god. Miss Tita gave me this information flatly, without expression. Her tone might have made it a piece of trivial gossip, but it stirred me deeply as she dropped the words into the summer night. It seemed such a direct testimony. "Fancy, fancy," I murmured. And then, "Tell me this, please. Has she got a portrait of him? They are distressingly rare." "A portrait? I don't know," said Miss Tita, and now there was discomfiture in her face. "Well, good night," she added, and she turned into the house. I accompanied her into the wide, dusky, stone-paved passage which on the ground floor corresponded with our grand sala. It opened at one end into the garden, at the other upon the canal, and was lighted now only by the small lamp that was always left for me to take up as I went to bed. An extinguished candle which Miss Tita apparently had brought down with her stood on the same table with it. Good night," I replied, keeping beside her as she went to get her light. "Surely you would know, shouldn't you, if she had one?" "If she had what?" the poor lady asked, looking at me queerly over the flame of her candle. "A portrait of the god. I don't know what I wouldn't give to see it." "I don't know what she has got. She keeps her things locked up." And Miss Tita went away toward the staircase with the sense, evidently, that she had said too much. I let her go. I wished not to frighten her, and I contented myself with remarking that Miss Bordereau would not have locked up such a glorious possession as that, a thing a person would be proud of and hang up in a prominent place on the parlor wall. Therefore, of course, she had not any portrait. Miss Tita made no direct answer to this, and candle in hand, with her back to me, ascended 2 or 3 stairs. Then she stopped short and turned round, looking at me across the dusky space. "Do you write? Do you write?" There was a shake in her voice. She could scarcely bring out what she wanted to ask. "Do I write? Oh, don't speak of my writing on the same day with Aspern's." "Do you write about him? Do you pry into his life?" "Ah, that's your aunt's question. It can't be yours," I said in a tone of slightly wounded sensibility. "All the more reason that you should answer it. Do you, please?" I thought I had allowed for the falsehoods I should have to tell, but I found that in fact, when it came to the point, I had not. Besides, now that I had an opening there was a kind of relief in being frank. Lastly, it was perhaps fanciful, even fatuous, I guessed that Miss Tita personally would not in the last resort be less my friend. So after a moment's hesitation I answered, "Yes, I have written about him, and I am looking for more material. In heaven's name, have you got any?" "Santo Dio!" she exclaimed, without heeding my question, and she hurried upstairs and out of sight. I might count upon her in the last resort, but for the present she was visibly alarmed. The proof of it was that she began to hide again, so that for a fortnight I never beheld her. I found my patience ebbing, and after 4 or 5 days of this I told the gardener to stop the flowers. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of the Aspern Papers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. One afternoon, as I came down from my quarters to go out, I found Miss Tita in the sala. It was our first encounter on that ground since I had come to the house. She put on no air of being there by accident. There was an ignorance of such arts in her angular, diffident directness. That I might be quite sure she was waiting for me, she informed me of the fact and told me that Miss Bordereau wished to see me. She would take me into the room at that moment if I had time. If I had been late for a love tryst I would have stayed for this, and I quickly signified that I should be delighted to wait upon the old lady. "She wants to talk with you, to know you," Miss Tita said, smiling as if she herself appreciated that idea, and she led me to the door of her aunt's apartment. I stopped her for a moment before she had opened it, looking at her with some curiosity. I told her that this was a great satisfaction to me and a great honor, But all the same I should like to ask what had made Miss Bordereau change so suddenly. It was only the other day that she wouldn't suffer me near her." Miss Tita was not embarrassed by my question. She had as many little unexpected serenities as if she told fibs, but the odd part of them was that they had on the contrary their source in her truthfulness. "Oh, my aunt changes," she answered. "It's so terribly dull. I suppose she's tired." "But you told me that she wanted more and more to be alone." Poor Miss Tita colored, as if she found me over insistent. "Well, if you don't believe she wants to see you, I haven't invented it. I think people often are capricious when they are very old." "That's perfectly true. I only wanted to be clear as to whether you have repeated to her what I told you the other night." "What you told me?" "About Geoffrey Aspern, that I'm looking for materials." "If I had told her, do you think she would have sent for you?" "That's exactly what I want to know. If she wants to keep him to herself she might have sent for me to tell me so." "She won't speak of him," said Miss Tita. Then as she opened the door she added in a lower tone, "I have told her nothing." The old woman was sitting in the same place in which I had seen her last, in the same position, with the same mystifying bandage over her eyes. Her welcome was to turn her almost invisible face to me and show me that while she sat silent she saw me clearly. I made no motion to shake hands with her. I felt too well on this occasion that that was out of place forever. It had been sufficiently enjoined upon me that she was too sacred for that sort of reciprocity, too venerable to touch. There was something so grim in her aspect; it was partly the accident of her green shade, as I stood there to be measured, that I ceased on the spot to feel any doubt as to her knowing my secret, though I did not in the least suspect that Miss Tita had not just spoken the truth. She had not betrayed me, but the old woman's brooding instinct had served her. She had turned me over and over in the long still hours, and she had guessed. The worst of it was that she looked terribly like an old woman who at a pinch would burn her papers. Miss Tita pushed a chair forward, saying to me, "This will be a good place for you to sit." As I took possession of it I asked after Miss Bordereau's health, expressed the hope that in spite of the very hot weather it was satisfactory. She replied that it was good enough, that it was a great thing to be alive. "Oh, as to that it depends upon what you compare it with!" I exclaimed, laughing. "I don't compare, I don't compare. If I did that I should have given everything up long ago." I like to think that this was a subtle allusion to the rapture she had known in the society of Geoffrey Aspern, though it was true that such an allusion would have accorded ill with the wish I imputed to her to keep him buried in her soul. What it accorded with was my constant conviction that no human being had ever had a more delightful social gift than his, and what it seemed to convey was that nothing in the world was worth speaking of if one pretended to speak of that. But one did not. Miss Tita sat down beside her aunt, looking as if she had reason to believe some very remarkable conversation would come off between us. "It's about the beautiful flowers," said the old lady. "You sent us so many. I ought to have thanked you for them before, but I don't write letters, and I receive only at long intervals." She had not thanked me while the flowers continued to come, but she departed from her custom so far as to send for me as soon as she began to fear that they would not come any more. I noted this. I remembered what an acquisitive propensity she had shown when it was a question of extracting gold from me, and I privately rejoiced at the happy thought I had had in suspending my tribute. She had missed it, and she was willing to make a concession to bring it back. At the first sign of this concession I could only go to meet her. "I am afraid you have not had many of late, but they shall begin again immediately, tomorrow, tonight." "Oh, do send us some tonight!" Miss Tita cried, as if it were an immense circumstance. "What else should you do with them? It isn't a manly taste to make a bower of your room," the old woman remarked. "I don't make a bower of my room, but I am exceedingly fond of growing flowers, of watching their ways. There is nothing unmanly in that. It has been the amusement of philosophers, of statesmen in retirement, even, I think, of great captains. I suppose you know you can sell them, those you don't use," Miss Bordereau went on. "I dare say they wouldn't give you much for them; still you could make a bargain." "Oh, I have never made a bargain, as you ought to know. My gardener disposes of them and I ask no questions." "I would ask a few, I can promise you," said Miss Bordereau, and it was the first time I had heard her laugh. I could not get used to the idea that this vision of pecuniary profit was what drew out the divine Juliana most. "Come into the garden yourself and pick them; come as often as you like. Come every day; they are all for you," I pursued, addressing Miss Tita and carrying off this veracious statement by treating it as an innocent joke. "I can't imagine why she doesn't come down," I added for Miss Bordereau's benefit. "You must make her come; you must come up and fetch her," said the old woman, to my stupefaction. "That odd thing you have made in the corner would be a capital place for her to sit." The allusion to my arbor was irreverent; it confirmed the impression I had already received that there was a flicker of impertinence in Miss Bordereau's talk, a strange mocking lambency which must have been a part of her adventurous youth and which had outlived passions and faculties. None the less I asked, "Wouldn't it be possible for you to come down there yourself? Wouldn't it do you good to sit there in the shade, in the sweet air?" "Oh, sir, when I move out of this it won't be to sit in the air, and I'm very afraid that any that may be stirring around me won't be particularly sweet. It will be a very dark shade indeed. But that won't be just yet," Miss Bordereau continued cannily, as if to correct any hopes that this courageous allusion to the last receptacle of her mortality might lead me to entertain. "I have sat here many a day and I have had enough of arbors in my time. But I'm not afraid to wait till I'm called." Miss Tita had expected some interesting talk, but perhaps she found it less genial on her aunt's side, considering that I had been sent for with a civil intention, than she had hoped. As if to give the conversation a turn that would put our companion in a light more favorable, she said to me, "Didn't I tell you the other night that she had sent me out? You see that I can do what I like." "Do you pity her? Do you teach her to pity herself?" Miss Bordereau demanded before I had time to answer this appeal. "She has a much easier life than I had when I was her age." "You must remember that it has been quite open to me to think you rather inhuman." "Inhuman? That's what the poets used to call the women 100 years ago. Don't try that; you won't do as well as they," Juliana declared. "There is no more poetry in the world, that I know of at least. But I won't bandy words with you," she pursued, and I well remember the old fashioned artificial sound she gave to the speech. "You have made me talk, talk; it isn't good for me at all." I got up at this and told her I would take no more of her time, but she detained me to ask, "Do you remember the day I saw you about the rooms, that you offered us the use of your gondola?" And when I assented promptly, struck again with her disposition to make a good thing of being there and wondering what she now had in her eye, she broke out, "Why don't you take that girl out in it and show her the place?" "Oh, dear aunt, what do you want to do with me?" cried the girl with a piteous quaver. "I know all about the place." "Well then, go with him as a cicerone," said Miss Bordereau, with an effort of something like cruelty in her implacable power of retort, an incongruous suggestion that she was a sarcastic, profane, cynical old woman. "Haven't we heard that there have been all sorts of changes in all these years? You ought to see them, and at your age I don't mean because you're so young you ought to take the chances that come. You're old enough, my dear, and this gentleman won't hurt you. He will show you the famous sunsets if they still go on. Do they go on?" The sun set for me so long ago. "But that's not a reason. Besides, I shall never miss you. You think you are too important. Take her to the piazza; it used to be very pretty," Miss Bordereau continued, addressing herself to me. "What have they done with the funny old church? I hope it hasn't tumbled down. Let her look at the shops; She may take some money, she may buy what she likes." Poor Miss Tita had got up, discountenanced and helpless, and as we stood there before her aunt it would certainly have seemed to a spectator of the scene that the old woman was amusing herself at our expense. Miss Tita protested in a confusion of exclamations and murmurs, but I lost no time in saying that if she would do me the honor to accept the hospitality of my boat I would engage that she should not be bored. Or if she did not want so much of my company, the boat itself, with the gondolier, was at her service. He was a capital oar, and she might have every confidence. Miss Tita, without definitely answering this speech, looked away from me, out of the window, as if she were going to cry, and I remarked that once we had Miss Bordereau's approval we could easily come to an understanding. We would take an hour, whichever she liked, one of the very next days. As I made my obeisance to the old lady I asked her if she would kindly permit me to see her again. For a moment she said nothing. Then she inquired, "Is it very necessary to your happiness?" "It diverts me more than I can say." "You are wonderfully civil. Don't you know it almost kills me?" "How can I believe that when I see you more animated, more brilliant than when I came in?" "That is very true, aunt," said Miss Tita. "I think it does you good." "Isn't it touching, the solicitude we each have that the other shall enjoy herself?" sneered Miss Bordereau. "If you think me brilliant today you don't know what you're talking about. You have never seen an agreeable woman. Don't try to pay me a compliment. I have been spoiled," she went on. "My door is shut, but you may sometimes knock." With this she dismissed me and I left the room. The latch closed behind me, but Miss Tita, contrary to my hope, had remained within. I passed slowly across the hall, and before taking my way downstairs I waited a little. My hope was answered. After a minute Miss Tita followed me. "That's a delightful idea about the piazza," I said. "When will you go? Tonight? Tomorrow?" She had been disconcerted, as I have mentioned, but I had already perceived, and I was to observe again, that when Miss Tita was embarrassed she did not, as most women would have done, turn away from you and try to escape, but came closer, as it were, with a deprecating, clinging appeal to be spared, to be protected. Her attitude was perpetually a sort of prayer for assistance, for explanation, and yet no woman in the world could have been less of a comedian. From the moment you were kind to her she depended on you absolutely. Her self-consciousness dropped from her and she took the greatest intimacy, the innocent intimacy which was the only thing she could conceive, for granted. She told me she did not know what had got into her aunt. She had changed so quickly, she had got some idea. I replied that first she must find out what the idea was and then let me know. We would go and have an ice together at Florian's and she should tell me while we listened to the band. "Oh, it will take me a long time to find out," she said rather ruefully, and she could promise me this satisfaction neither for that night nor for the next. I was patient now, however, for I felt that I had only to wait, and in fact at the end of the week, one lovely evening after dinner, she stepped into my gondola, to which, in honor of the occasion, I had attached a second oar. We swept in the course of 5 minutes into the Grand Canal, whereupon she uttered a murmur of ecstasy as fresh as if she had been a tourist just arrived. She had forgotten how splendid the great waterway looked on a clear hot summer evening, and how the sense of floating between marble palaces and reflected lights disposed the mind to sympathetic talk. We floated long and far, and though Miss Tita gave no high-pitched voice to her satisfaction, I felt that she surrendered herself. She was more than pleased, she was transported. The whole thing was an immense liberation. The gondola moved with slow strokes to give her time to enjoy it, and she listened to the plash of the oars, which grew louder and more musically liquid as we passed into narrow canals, as if it were a revelation of Venice. When I asked her how long it was since she had been in a boat, she answered, "Oh, I don't know, a long time. Not since my aunt began to be ill." This was not the only example she gave me of her extreme vagueness about the previous years and the line which marked off the period when Miss Bordereau flourished. I was not at liberty to keep her out too long, but we took a considerable giro before going to the piazza. I asked her no questions, keeping the conversation on purpose away from her domestic situation and the things I wanted to know. I poured treasures of information about Venice into her ears, described Florence and Rome, discoursed to her on the charms and advantages of travel. She reclined, receptive, on the deep leather cushions, turned her eyes conscientiously to everything I pointed out to her, and never mentioned to me till some time afterward that she might be supposed to know Florence better than I, as she had lived there for years with Miss Bordereau. At last she asked, with the shy impatience of a child, "Are we not really going to the piazza? That's what I want to see." I immediately gave the order that we should go straight, and then we sat silent with the expectation of arrival. As some time still passed, however, she said suddenly, of her own movement, "I have found out what is the matter with my aunt. She is afraid you will go." "What has put that into her head?" "She has had an idea that you have not been happy. That is why she is different now." "You mean she wants to make me happier?" "Well, she wants you not to go. She wants you to stay." "I suppose you mean on account of the rent," I remarked candidly. Miss Tita's candor showed itself a match for my own. "Yes, you know, so that I shall have more." "How much does she want you to have?" I asked, laughing. "She ought to fix the sum, so that I may stay till it's made up." "Oh, that wouldn't please me," said Miss Tita. "It would be unheard of, your taking that trouble." "But suppose I should have my own reasons for staying in Venice?" "Then it would be better for you to stay in some other house." "And what would your aunt say to that?" "She wouldn't like it at all. But I should think you would do well to give up your reasons and go away altogether." "Dear Miss Tita," I said, "it's not so easy to give them up." She made no immediate answer to this, but after a moment she broke out, "I think I know what your reasons are." "I dare say, because the other night I almost told you how I wish you would help me to make them good." "I can't do that without being false to my aunt." "What do you mean, being false to her?" "Why, she would never consent to what you want. She has been asked, she has been written to. It has made her fearfully angry." "Then she has got papers of value?" I demanded quickly. "Oh, she has got everything!" sighed Miss Tita with a curious weariness, a sudden lapse into gloom. These words caused all my pulses to throb, for I regarded them as precious evidence. For some minutes I was too agitated to speak, and in the interval the gondola approached the Piazzetta. After we had disembarked I asked my companion whether she would rather walk round the square or go and sit at the door of the cafe, to which she replied that she would do whichever I liked best. I must only remember how little time she had. I assured her there was plenty to do both, and we made the circuit of the long arcades. Her spirits revived at the sight of the bright shop windows, and she lingered and stopped, admiring or disapproving of their contents, asking me what I thought of things, theorizing about prices. My attention wandered from her words of a while before, "Oh, she has got everything," echoed so in my consciousness. We sat down at last in the crowded circle at Florian's, finding an unoccupied table among those that were ranged in the square. It was a splendid night and all the world was out of doors. Miss Tita could not have wished the elements more auspicious for her return to society. I saw that she enjoyed it even more than she told. She was agitated with the multitude of her impressions. She had forgotten what an attractive thing the world is, and it was coming over her that somehow she had for the best years of her life been cheated of it. This did not make her angry, but as she looked all over the charming scene her face had, in spite of its smile of appreciation, the flush of a sort of wounded surprise. She became silent, as if she were thinking with a secret sadness of opportunities forever lost, which ought to have been easy, and this gave me a chance to say to her, Did you mean a while ago that your aunt has a plan of keeping me on by admitting me occasionally to her presence? She thinks it will make a difference with you if you sometimes see her. She wants you so much to stay that she is willing to make that concession." "And what good does she consider that I think it will do me to see her?" "I don't know. She thinks it's interesting," said Miss Tita simply. "You told her you found it so." "So I did, but everyone doesn't think so." "No, of course not, or more people would try." "Well, if she is capable of making that reflection she is capable of making this further one," I went on, "that I must have a particular reason for not doing as others do, in spite of the interest she offers, for not leaving her alone." Miss Tita looked as if she failed to grasp this rather complicated proposition, so I continued. "If you have not told her what I said to you the other night, may she not at least have guessed it?" "I don't know. She is very suspicious." "But she has not been made so by indiscreet curiosity, by persecution?" "No, no, it isn't that," said Miss Tita, turning on me a somewhat troubled face. "I don't know how to say it. It's on account of something ages ago, before I was born in her life." "Something? What sort of thing?" I asked, as if I myself could have no idea. "Oh, she has never told me," Miss Tita answered, and I was sure she was speaking the truth. Her extreme limpidity was almost provoking, and I felt for the moment that she would have been more satisfactory if she had been less ingenuous. "Do you suppose it's something to which Geoffrey Aspern's letters and papers, I mean the things in her possession, have reference?" "I dare say it is!" my companion exclaimed, as if this were a very happy suggestion. "I have never looked at any of those things." "None of them? Then how do you know what they are?" "I don't," said Miss Tita placidly. "I have never had them in my hands. But I have seen them when she has had them out." "Does she have them out often?" "Not now, but she used to. She is very fond of them." "In spite of their being compromising?" "Compromising?" Miss Tita repeated as if she were ignorant of the meaning of the word. I felt almost as one who corrupts the innocence of youth. "I mean their containing painful memories." "Oh, I don't think they are painful." "You mean that you don't think they affect her reputation?" At this a singular look came into the face of Miss Bordereau's niece, a kind of confession of helplessness, an appeal to me to deal fairly, generously with her. I had brought her to the piazza, placed her among charming influences, paid her an attention she appreciated, and now I seemed to let her perceive that all this had been a bribe to make her turn in some way against her aunt. She was of a yielding nature and capable of doing almost anything to please a person who was kind to her, but the greatest kindness of all would be not to presume too much on this. It was strange enough, as I afterward thought, that she had not the least air of resenting my want of consideration for her aunt's character, which would have been in the worst possible taste if anything less vital, from my point of view, had been at stake. I don't think she really measured it. "Do you mean that she did something bad?" she asked in a moment. "Heaven forbid I should say so, and it's none of my business. Besides, if she did," I added, laughing, "it was in other ages, in another world. But why should she not destroy her papers?" "Oh, she loves them too much." "Even now, when she may be near her end?" "Perhaps when she's sure of that she will." "Well, Miss Tita," I said, "it's just what I should like you to prevent." "How can I prevent it?" "Couldn't you get them away from her?" "And give them to you?" This put the case very crudely, though I am sure there was no irony in her intention. "Oh, I mean that you might let me see them and look them over. It isn't for myself; there's no personal avidity in my desire. It's simply that they would be of such immense interest to the public, such immeasurable importance as a contribution to Geoffrey Aspern's history." She listened to me in her usual manner, as if my speech were full of reference to things she had never heard of, and I felt particularly like the reporter of a newspaper who forces his way into a house of mourning. This was especially the case when after a moment she said, "There was a gentleman who some time ago wrote to her in very much those words. He also wanted her papers." "And did she answer him?" I asked, rather ashamed of myself for not having her rectitude. Only when he had written 2 or 3 times. He made her very angry." "And what did she say?" "She said he was a devil," Miss Tita replied simply. "She used that expression in her letter?" "Oh no, she said it to me. She made me write to him." "And what did you say?" "I told her there were no papers at all." "Ah, poor gentleman!" I exclaimed. "I knew there were, but I wrote what she bade me." "Of course you had to do that. But I hope I shall not pass for a devil." "It will depend on what you ask me to do for you," said Miss Tita, smiling. "Oh, if there is a chance of your thinking so, my affair is in a bad way. I shan't ask you to steal for me, nor even to fib, for you can't fib unless on paper. But the principal thing is this, to prevent her from destroying the papers." "Why, I have no control of her," said Miss Tita. "It is she who controls me." "But she doesn't control her own arms and legs, does she? The way she would naturally destroy her letters would be to burn them. Now she can't burn them without fire, and she can't get fire unless you give it to her." "I have always done everything she has asked," my companion rejoined. "Besides, there's Olimpia." I was on the point of saying that Olimpia was probably corruptible, but I thought it best not to sound that note; so I simply inquired if that faithful domestic could not be managed. "Everyone can be managed by my aunt," said Miss Tita; and then she observed that her holiday was over, she must go home. I laid my hand on her arm across the table to stay a moment. "What I want of you is a general promise to help me." "Oh, how can I, how can I?" she asked, wondering and troubled. She was half surprised, half frightened at my wishing to make her play an active part. "This is the main thing, to watch her carefully and warn me in time before she commits that horrible sacrilege. I can't watch her when she makes me go out." "That's very true." "And when you do too." "Mercy on us! Do you think she will have done anything tonight?" "I don't know. She is very cunning. Are you trying to frighten me?" I asked. I felt this inquiry sufficiently answered when my companion murmured in a musing, almost envious way, "Oh, but she loves them, she loves them!" This reflection, repeated with such emphasis, gave me great comfort, but to obtain more of that balm I said, "If she shouldn't intend to destroy the objects we speak of before her death she will probably have made some disposition by will." "By will?" "Hasn't she made a will for your benefit?" "Why, she has so little to leave. That's why she likes money," said Miss Tita. "Might I ask, since we're really talking things over, what you and she live on?" "On some money that comes from America, from a lawyer. He sends it every quarter. It isn't much." "And won't she have disposed of that?" My companion hesitated. I saw she was blushing. "I believe it's mine," she said, and the look and tone which accompanied these words betrayed so the absence of the habit of thinking of herself that I almost thought her charming. The next instant she added, "But she had a lawyer once, ever so long ago, and some people came and signed something." "They were probably witnesses. And you were not asked to sign? Well then," I argued rapidly and hopefully, "it is because you are the legatee. She has left all the documents to you." "If she has it's with very strict conditions," Miss Tita responded, rising quickly, while the movement gave the words a little character of decision. They seemed to imply that the bequest would be accompanied with a command that the articles bequeathed should remain concealed from every inquisitive eye, and that I was very much mistaken if I thought she was the person to depart from an injunction so solemn. "Oh, of course you'll have to abide by the terms," I said, and she uttered nothing to mitigate the severity of this conclusion. None the less later, just before we disembarked at her own door on our return, which had taken place almost in silence, she said to me abruptly, "I will do what I can to help you." I was grateful for this; it was very well so far as it went, but it did not keep me from remembering that night, in a worried waking hour, that I now had her word for it to reinforce my own impression that the old woman was very cunning. Chapter 7